Emphasis on land reform. Asset poverty often lies at the core of poverty. Inaccessibility to land is one of the fundamental determinants of poverty, and land redistribution is a powerful weapon against poverty. Lack of assets is an effect as well as a cause of poverty in terms of income opportunities, consumption, capability building of people and their institutions. Access to land and natural resources, invariably, have defined not only economic but also social and political deprivation of the masses of the developing world.
There are about 37 billion acres of habitable land across the world. Indigenous people and local communities occupy 65% of it. And yet these groups, a population of 1.5 billion, barely own 18% of the land they occupy. So much land in the world is owned by so few. Throughout history, people in power use land to control economic resources and retain political control, further exacerbating inequality. Thankfully, there's a fix. It's called land reform. Land reform means changing the law to change who owns the land. It's a radical idea, transforming the very root of power. Land reform can take land from the ruling class and give it to the historically oppressed. There are numerous goals of land reform: reducing poverty, expanding rural development, returning land to its previous owners. However, there are dangers. Land reform can mean seizing land from people without any redress. And throughout history, it's caused violence and started revolutions. However, the world is facing a massive population explosion. And the pressure on land for food, water, and housing is growing. Readdressing how land is used is an urgent issue. Can humanity afford to keep so much land in the hands of so few?
The land reform which was carried out in Japan between 1946 and 1950 is regarded as one of the most successful of the land reforms and has become the model for land reform in other countries. The land reform process started in Japan with the enactment of Farmland Adjustment Law of 1938 and the Owner-Farmer Establishment Special Measures Law in 1946. The purpose of land reform was to reduce the wide gap between absentee landlords who owned agricultural land but did not farm it themselves, and tenant farmers who rented the land in exchange for giving the landlord a high proportion of the crop. The land reform laws were intended to limit the amount of farmland one household could own to about the amount of land that one family could farm themselves, without outside labor. The government forced absentee landlords to sell all their land to the government. As the first step of the execution of the program, members of the village land committees were elected in December 1946 and those of at the prefecture level in February 1947. As the occupation forces ordered that the reform had to be accomplished within 2 years, the first compulsory purchase was done in March 1947, just after the elections of the committees. The purchase was successively executed over 10 times and 1,630,000 hectares of the farmland was acquired by the government by the end of 1948. The acquired land was immediately sold to cultivators. How thoroughly the conversion of these tenants into owner farmers was carried out may be gauged by referring to Figure 1. The figure shows that tenant farmers, who before the war had accounted for nearly one-third of the total, accounted for 5%, by 1950, while part owner farmers, who had accounted for 40% of the total before the war, accounted for somewhat more than 30%. On the other side, the owners, who before the war accounted for 30% of the total, now accounted for 62%. The same situation is apparent in the light of the land statistics, and we find that land cultivated in tenancy, which before the war had accounted for nearly 50% of cultivated land, had shrunk by 1950 to around 10%. In addition, we must note in connection with the figure that although the land reform itself was completed in 1950, the numbers of owner farmers have been increasing from that time up to the present day. In 1965, owners exceeded 80% of the total, while tenants accounted for less than 2%. Sugar has been Cuba's primary agricultural crop since its Spanish colonial period. During that time, a well-to-do class of landowners accumulated large estates, called latifundios, that produced sugar, livestock, and fruit. Even after the Spanish-American War and the end of the colonial era, foreign interests, especially from the United States, owned significant tracts of land and invested large sums of money in latifundios operations. This process drove up the production of sugarcane for export, but marginalized the small-scale campesino or the peasant farmers, who focused on more diversified crops. By 1958, 73.3% of Cuba's available farming land was concentrated in the hands of just 9.4% of landowners. In 1959, the new revolutionary government introduced the first agrarian reform law as one of the first major structural changes of the revolutionary era. The law eradicated large estates, nationalized all foreign-owned rural property, where land was transferred to peasant farmers who had previously worked on it without titles, and created a state agricultural sector to maintain control of around a third of national farmland. The Second Agrarian Reform Law, introduced in 1963, further decreased the allowable size of private farms by nationalizing all property holdings over 67 hectares, thus giving the state control of around two-thirds of all national farmland. Over the decades that followed, the state gradually took ownership of more tracts of land, eventually coming to own 82% of active farmland by 1988. Accordingly, the Fourth Agrarian Reform was initiated in 2008, where the difficult conditions for agricultural recovery in state or recently privatized lands gave rise to a growing stock of idle lands, raising the urgent need for their redistribution under usufruct conditions to new peasants, traditional peasants, and cooperatives with workforce availability. The trend shown by the evolution of the land ownership structure in the country was the historical condition for the nationalization of rural poverty, for subsequent redistribution as private, peasant or cooperative ownership. The land reforms enforced over the years had significant effect on the Cuban structure of land ownership and distribution. It provided the foundation for a fundamental transformation in the quality of life of the rural population that endures up to this day. Since 2008, 173,000 of the 194,000 Cubans who applied for land grants received land, totaling of more than 3.5 million acres. The land use rights are provided for 10 years, with the possibility of extension, as long as the applicant keeps framing the land. As the redistribution of land was enacted and considered for years, rural farmers were able to become permanent wage earners on the farms they worked at. Not only land occupancy changed, but the labor as well, and the conversion of farm workers to farm managers is the result of this shift. The considerations through land reforms and priority towards rural workers, particularly in the agricultural sector, decreased the gap of attaining progress and increased the independency in owning and farming of land. Land reforms by the government with a top-down approach and narrow administrative implementation are sometimes insufficient in addressing problems with regards to land fights. India is known to have slow and uneven execution of agrarian reform. But this one of the states who succeeded in the implementation of reformation in the country, which is the Kerala. The Kerala land reforms is viewed as perhaps the most drastic of land reform legislations in the country, has given Kerala the reputation of being the model in this respect. Every form of political activity except armed revolution took place in Kerala's land reform struggles. Land reform aims at the redistribution of land ownership in favor of the cultivating class, regulation, and rationalization of rent, improving the size of farms and providing security of tenure in order to transfer in traditional agriculture and raise cultivators to new heights. Land reform also helps landless agricultural tenants in a way that it changes the agrarian structure in a way as not to obstruct but promote the growth of agriculture, and replace the old land system by a new one, free from the exploitative features which characterized the former. The formation of Kerala was, however, a major turning point of India in terms of agrarian change. Kerala's land reform is widely regarded as one of the most thorough and well implemented in South Asia. The abolition of tenancy transformed the parasitic landlord class of mostly high-caste Brahmin temple priests and rent recipients into school teachers, government administrators, and medium-sized farmers. Although some have suffered, most appear to have adjusted successfully to the loss of their giant estates and now contribute to the development of Kerala's economy. Land reform in Zimbabwe. Land has been a source of political conflict in Zimbabwe since colonization, both within indigenous black communities and, especially, between white settlers and the black rural communities. The land distribution in Zimbabwe after colonization was well inclined to the white settlers, who were only 3% of the total population yet controlled 51% of the land, leaving 49% of the land to the 97% of the population. The Zimbabwean government began its land reforms in the 1980s to address the imbalances in land access, ownership and use that had existed in the country before independence. The land reform program in Zimbabwe can be referred to as the transferring of land from a minority white farming group to black. The fast-track phase of its land reform began in 2000, when 10,816,886 hectares were acquired and 162,161 families resettled. A total number of 237,858 households were reported to have received access to land under the program. Thousands of white farmers were forcibly evicted during the process. The reform program was mainly characterized by widespread farm invasions and seizures, which were mostly illegal. The reform has not delivered the outcomes the government intended. It has resulted instead in violence, a lack of legitimacy in land ownership, and a chronic weakening of the country's agricultural infrastructure, all of which have contributed to Zimbabwe's deteriorating social and economic conditions. The agricultural productivity was heavily affected and the manufacturing sector reduced productivity, and the whole economy shrunk, and this affected employment levels.
Land reform in Philippines. The disadvantaged rural farming has been inherited from the Spanish labor system that allowed land ownership into the control of the higher-class citizens, while farmers remained sharecroppers. Under sharecropping arrangements, the farmers who cultivated the lands have no freedom to choose crops to farm and had no ability to own the land they tilled. During the American period, the hacienda system had been viewed by the Americans as beneficial to them and encouraged landlords to maintain their power and engage in business, handing out land titles to formalize their claims. Since the early 1900s, the Philippines is considered as one of the countries that has the longest-running land reform programs in the world. Land reform was initially instituted as a developmental program involving mainly the distribution of public lands. However, in 1970s, it became a strategy to develop agricultural productivity by dismantling the hacienda estate system and eliminating inefficient tenancy arrangements in the Philippine agricultural sector. In 1988, the government passed the Comprehensive Agrarian Land Reform Program, CARP, which was created to end unfair land ownership practices by distributing the land and providing proper documentation to its rightful owners, or agricultural reform beneficiaries. But, only 52% of them were able to be provided a land ownership documentation. The Department of Agrarian Reform's first administrative order of 2019 simplified the process of land conversion by enforcing necessary productivity and land use clearances from the Department of Agriculture and Land Use Regulatory Board. To further improve the land reform in the Philippines, the World Bank's executive directors approved the $370 million support to parcelization of lands for individual titling project, SPLIT, which is established to accelerate the subdivision of collective certificates of land ownership award and generate individual titles on lands. The World Bank Acting Country Director for Brunei, Malaysia, Philippines, and Thailand, H.M. Fox, said that the project will provide them the opportunity to receive legal proof and security of individual land rights, and encourage them to adopt better technologies for greater productivity and higher incomes. Accordingly, he added that the improved land tenure security would contribute to poverty reduction and strengthen farmers' resilience against the impacts of COVID-19 pandemic. The land reform programs in the Philippines aim to resolve the issues over having no legal ownership rights of rural farmers. The progress and mitigation of poverty through land reforms has been continuously considered for years and has become part of developmental plans for the country. Based on agricultural census data, the period after the reform shows a substantial reallocation of farms and land to smaller farm sizes, with average farm size dropping by about 30%. The figure shows that the share of farms operating below 1 hectare of land increased from 23% in the 1981 census, prior to the reform, to 40% in the 2002 census, after the reform. This presents that by 2002, there is the increase in the access on lands under 1 hectare. Whereas, it can be seen that there is a large decrease of operations or distribution on the land area of 2 to 5 hectares, from over 35% in 1981 to 24 to 25% in 2002. Hence, it shows that there is the decline over the farm size distribution on larger land area in 2002. Policy implications. Land reform is an effective way to foster equal distribution of agricultural incomes and facilitate rural development. However, land reform policy can also be ineffective because of the protracted and poor implementation of the program that moved the agriculture sector backwards. Agricultural land property rights have been complicated by legal restrictions on the transferability of land reform awarded lands, a multiplicity of owners or rights to land, and errors in land reform coverage and beneficiary identification. These issues complicate land transactions and hinder investment into the sector. Under the land reform of Japan, it is supposed that the country has succeeded in the implementation of their policy. The effectiveness in the implementation can be seen as the land accounted for new landowners now increased through conversion of tenants. The country of Cuba has a proper transformation of land reform policy in the country that shows the effectiveness in the implementation. The effectiveness of the policy shows not only for the benefit of the whole country but also to the sake of the farmers. The country of India, specifically in the state of Kerala, was also regarded with land fight. But then after addressing problems and prioritizing the implementation of the policy, Kerala became of the most thoroughly implemented policy in South Asia. There is a popular issue in land conflict in Zimbabwe, South Africa, particularly the matter between the black and white groups. The policy implemented instead results as a failure to the country after violence has occurred that affects the agricultural activity to get weakened. Over the past years, the Philippines has implemented the agrarian reform policy and experienced slow growth and modification of poverty. Since the policy was considered and become part of the development plans of the country, it contributed to poverty reduction. The causes of failure of land reform may be linked to various reasons such as lack of political will, unorganized, inarticulate, and passive nature of agricultural workers, apathetic attitude of the bureaucracy, legal hurdles in the way of implementation of land reforms, lack of uniformity in land reform laws, etc. For a land reform policy to be successful, it must be pragmatic, planned carefully, and executed in a uniformly. In conclusions, the policies and institutions that impede the operation of the land market could prove particularly detrimental when accompanying land reforms. A well-functioning rental market for land can substantially mitigate the negative effects of imposing a more egalitarian distribution of land holdings, as these markets would tend to disassociate operated land from land rights. Delinking land use from land rights can also have substantial effects on migration and occupation decisions, further contributing to increases in farm size and productivity in agriculture. Even if land reforms could potentially generate a productivity gain by channeling land to constrained but productive farmers, the way the reforms are implemented in practice, by administratively reallocating land based on size rather than productivity, critically miss out on this potential gain.